deeply for coming. It's great to see so many people in attendance. It's very rare that academic talks attract as much interest as this. This is obviously a current affairs issue, and so it's delightful to see all of you, and I hope that at least some of what will be said today will be of some interest to you. Secondly, I should thank the Abu Dhabi Institute and the Jordan Center for Advanced Russian Studies for co-sponsoring this event and for giving us an opportunity to share our thoughts about Ukraine. The format of this event is going to be that each of us is going to say a few words about our perception of the current state of relations between Russia and Ukraine. And so each of us will speak for about 15 minutes or so. And then we will have about half an hour for questions, if any of you have questions or comments about something that has been said. And perhaps we'll have a bit more of a discussion with a reaction to what has been said. Let me briefly introduce the speakers. So first we have Professor Yanni Kotsonis, who is an associate professor of history and of Russian and Slavic studies here at NYU. He is the founding director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. And Yanni works on issues of agrarian change and taxation policy in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Then we have Professor Josh Tucker, who is a professor of politics and, by courtesy, of Russian and Slavic studies. He's the co-director of the NYU Social Media and Political Participation Laboratory and co-director of the NYU Center for Social and Political Behavior. Josh works on issues of mass political engagement, political identities, and most recently is working on a book on historical legacies of communism in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, more broadly. We then have Arturas Rozenas, who is an assistant professor of politics here at NYU. Arturas works on authoritarian regimes with a specific emphasis on the Soviet Union, on state use of propaganda, and on electoral competition. And finally, I'm Leonid Peisakhin. I'm an assistant professor of political science at NYU Abu Dhabi. I'm here in New York for a year. And I work on issues of historical legacies. I study and finishing book manuscripts on the legacy of Austrian and Russian empires in Ukraine. And also I work on issues of state use of media to influence voting behavior and on good governance. So without further ado, I hand over to Yanni.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be with my colleagues once again. We've been having these things quite regularly as events have been unfolding in Russia and Ukraine. We always thought that Russia needed more attention in the media, and we've gotten what we asked for. What I'm going to do for you now is give you a sense of, redress one kind of balance that I see in the public discussion about Ukraine and about Russia in particular. And I find that living in the middle of the empire, there's only one left, and it's the American empire, makes it difficult to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to try to understand how the world might look to somebody else. And so if we were to look as Americans or as Europeans, Western Europeans, at a map of Europe, it would look something like this, where you have a core of, this is basically the EU, with pretensions, according to some, to move into the yellow part, which is Ukraine. So you can understand how it might look from the other side of the border, but for the most part, our attention is drawn to the western parts, and we don't really problematize what it does to the areas around it. By the same token, if we were to take, this is a NATO source, which is telling us about the expansion of NATO over time. And it looks like a nice historical progression, which is also a geographic progression. And we move increasingly east, we as NATO, that is. And we encompass more and more countries of Eastern and Central Europe. And again, it's sort of unproblematic, it seems, because we're really drawn into looking at the alliance itself and sort of the cohesion of Europe. And I'd put it to you that if you look at a map as drawn by somebody else, it would look like this. What you're looking at is a view from the North Pole. And if you're looking from the point of view of Russia, then you seem completely surrounded and encircled. You should let this sink in. So it's a different geography altogether and a different sense of centeredness, meaning you're looking at different things coming from different directions. I'll come back to these things over time. I'm not to say, and I wouldn't believe actually, that one or the other is the accurate picture. but to try to understand how the world looks from the Russian point of view, particularly the Russian government and geopolitically. What you think of it is a different matter. I'll get to what I think of it later on. But I'm a historian, and so I try to look at long-term perspectives. I'm not very good at telling the future, but then again, nobody is. I'll give a small stab at that at the end. But the main thing I want to do is to lay out how, from the Russian point of view, things have arrived where they are. And I would take you back to the year 1991, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was mainly the work of Russia itself, a moment when certain parts of the Russian political and soon-to-be economic elite decided that they were much better off without the Union, and that they would be a smaller, more supple, more of a core country in the various senses of the word, and they would no longer be burdened by empire. They would be able to be a wealthier country, and they would work not so much by the old means, which was occupation, meaning the Warsaw Pact or in the post-1945 period, but they worked by the new methods of a modern state and a modern great power as they understood it. And those methods would be largely economic. At the time, and ever since, Russian commentators and Russian officials would list catalogs of the natural resources they had, which they translated into economic might. They would list the oil and gas in particular. In those days, it was also the iron, coal, nickel, as the case may be. Resources, in other words, which they thought would be translated immediately into geopolitical power. It was better, in other words, to have a sphere of influence reinforced by economic power rather than an empire, rather than occupation, and rather than direct confrontation. It would be a new kind of Russia, in other words. And there was really a lot of hope, if hope is what you call it, that Russia would take its place among the great powers, would still be a great power, if not a superpower any longer, but that it would be able to work by the game, by the rules of a modern capitalist economy, and capitalist it became very quickly. From their point of view, every step of the way, beginning in 1991, not only did they face what they thought was contempt toward Russia, meaning a certain glee at their economic decline in the course of the 1990s and the chaos of the 1990s, but they felt constant pushbacks to what they thought were their legitimate interests. They faced in particular the twin forces of, as you see here, NATO. From their point of view, as you can see, it is a clear geographic progression and encroachment. From their point of view in particular, it's one thing to talk about Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland, even the Czech Republic and Slovakia. That was one matter, and there's always disquieting from their point of view. But as soon as the Baltic states, which had been the Baltic Soviet republics, became part of NATO, this was taken as a jab directly into the, not only on their borders, but also peeling off what they consider to be their sphere of influence. That they thought so is beyond doubt. Whether others agreed is really what the debate is about now. There was also the possibility, let me get you this nice little pointer, that NATO would continue to expand into this area down here, meaning the Caucasus. There was a direct confrontation. It didn't become too direct, but there was a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union over Georgia. The outbreak of war in 2008, which was really just a bilateral war, at the same time was accompanied by NATO ships, NATO alliance, NATO support. Who was right and who was wrong is beside the point from their point of view, because the real point was that this was supposed to be their sphere. There was also the economic question, which was that from the point of view of particularly American-led international institutions, joining the world economy meant opening your markets to foreign investment, which from the Russian point of view was a matter of foreign ownership. And it's true that, the way we call it in our lingo, the business climate was not appropriate to multinationals, by which they meant corruption, cronyism, handing out deals to friends and things like that. But in Russia, this is actually just called doing business. From the point of view of the Americans, this was an inhospitable climate to foreign investment. And sure enough, it's always on the bottom of the scales when it comes to corruption, when it comes to the climate for business and whatnot. And it's true that American multinationals, or foreign multinationals more generally, tried to invest in Russia and generally failed because they didn't know how to negotiate in the Russian political and economic system. The case of BP in particular was one of the most tragic and comical cases where they were basically fleeced by by Russian investors and were forced to abandon their investments altogether. This was only a couple of years ago. Putin's outbursts, particularly in the post-2000 period, meaning Putin Mark II, were, among many other things, about how it is that the foreigners, meaning the Westerners, will only be happy if we're completely prostrate and if we give up all of our resources and allow foreigners to own everything. And to him, this was a violation of the sense that Russia should remain an autonomous economy and also an autonomous political power and regional power. Again, from the Russian point of view, and again, you should look at that map, the many overtures and the many accommodations that the Russian government attempted were met with either silence, barely any public acknowledgement, and it was immediately followed by criticism over something else altogether. And the cases where Russia did try to actually cooperate with Western powers, the United States and NATO in particular, were quite a few, and they're not minor either. I'll give you as examples the Yugoslav crisis of 1996, where Russia cooperated fully, the use of Central Asian bases, which they thought was their sphere of influence, in order to supply American forces in Afghanistan. I would give you the example of of American NATO flyovers in Russian airspace in order to supply those armies. The case of Libya. Russia later said it was duped, but nevertheless went along and allowed for things to happen in the Security Council, even though they could have vetoed. Most recently, and here I personally am grateful, the intervention to make sure that the United States did not attack Syria as well, as if we needed to attack one more Arab country. But this was my take on it. From the Russian point of view, this was one more way in which Russia was trying to accommodate and trying to work with Western powers and was being dismissed more or less contemptuously. There was another dimension to it, which was, again, going back to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the creation of what they thought would be the new Russia, full of new Russians, which you can take in two senses if you speak Russian. But the new Russia was supposed to be a place of economic dynamism. It would have new industries, new skyscrapers, new financial centers, and so on and so forth. And these efforts have been ongoing. And they were creating what they thought would be a perfectly good example of a modern capitalist economy. And they did it more or less overnight. It would have such features as income inequality, which, as you know, we value, class stratification, which is a hallmark, endemic poverty, which would be permitted. It would have a dismantling of the social safety net, which is, as you know, is what capitalist societies often produce, particularly when left unchecked. It would have racialized local policies, and it would import cheap labor from places like Central Asia. In fact, most of the cheap labor in Russia today comes mainly from Central Asia, but a lot of it also from Ukraine itself. Despite having taken its place in what it thought was the modern capitalist world order, they felt that they were being criticized at every turn. Whatever they were doing, in other words, they would get criticized. They could not do right. They thought that at the very least this was hypocrisy. Why do we, Russians, get criticized for everything we do when someone like China does even worse when it comes to anything you might mention? Human rights, web freedom, freedom of the press, political expression, any of these things. China does about the same or worse and gets off scot-free. And of course the answer was that, and this is part of the key to it, that China is a bonanza for Western investors where Russia never really was. It's a different kind of economy altogether. I think the low point was reached in the build-up to the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Sochi, which you would need to understand was one of these moments when Russia was really going to take its place as a showcase to the world of the new Russia, what the new Russia would be. It invites the athletes, it invites journalists, it pays their way, it puts on new infrastructure, and it uses the methods that you use to put on any mega sports event, which is to say massive stimulus packages for new infrastructure, crony capitalism, which goes with it, the use of eminent domain, using public land for private purposes, profit orientation, and the hope that all along the way there would be some trickle down to help people like workers and other people in the economy as well. Meaning from their point of view, they were doing exactly what other hosts of Olympics had done, but more, hence the $50 billion price tag. And still they got criticized, and still all the Western press could show was those two toilets in Sochi which had been built in the same stall, if you remember that image. And from their point of view, this is anathema, meaning what else could we possibly do for you? Whatever we do, you're going to criticize us. The toilets, and I think it was the stray dogs was the other one. And around this same time, there was this pushback coming from Russia itself that whatever we do is always framed in a particularly American idiom. It's always the idiom of human rights and political and freedom of the press. These are always the two things that we'll talk about. From the Russian point of view, there must be much more to say about Russia. That can't be the whole story about Russia. But every time you would open the papers, the mainstream journals, this is the only thing they would talk about. It was as if you were to read about the United States in the foreign press, and all you would see is police brutality, day in, day out. Or the American press, all you would see is poverty, day in, day out. Or you'd open the press and you'd see nothing but the lens of race to understand everything in the United States but nothing else, meaning there must be more to say. This is, as I said, my summary of how I think the Russian position was being expressed, and part of the problem was that it was expressed so poorly. There was not a corpus of diplomats and public spokespersons who would come out and actually make the case for what Russia is going through and what Russia is trying to achieve. And this has been part of the problem, so that others have sometimes stepped in to do it for them, including American academics. Not many, but a few. And so the next set of questions is, from my point of view, is are they right? Meaning, what element of truth is in this, and to what extent should we actually accept that there's some truth to the Russian position, and how could we understand our position vis-a-vis the Russian position? If you were to look at it in terms of encirclement, which is the jargon being used in Russia today, which is we have always been encircled, we have always feared encirclement, and we have always been attacked. From their point of view, you can see that it might make sense historically, but I don't think we should be historically deterministic, meaning because it happened before, it doesn't mean it's going to happen again. But it's plausible to look at this picture from their point of view and say, yes, this, what you call NATO expansion is a jab at us and is directed at us. And I don't think any reasonable person would say that it's not directed at Russia. I mean, in fact, it is directed at Russia. The new Europe, in other words, is supposed to be a security and economic union, which is partly a bulwark against Russia itself, for better or for worse. But to pretend that it's not that, I think, would be to miss the point, it'd be disingenuous. Where did this all bring us? Originally, from the 1990s, it was the Russian position that the economy would do the work of diplomacy. And it became clear in the long term that this was not a sustainable foreign policy. It was not sustainable for a variety of reasons. One of them was we're only talking about a couple of resources. There's only so often you can cut off the gas to Western Europe. There's only so often you can cut off the spigots for the petroleum. It's only going to work a couple of times until, first of all, you hurt yourself because that's your main source of income in foreign trade. And also, sooner or later, people are going to look for other sources for the natural resources. This was one of the problems. But the other problem was that the entire Russian economy depends on the price of a barrel of oil. And when the price of oil goes down, Russia finds itself powerless. About 15% of the Russian economy is made up of oil and gas. 52% of the state budget is made up of oil and gas. 52%. This will help explain to you why there's been this grab by the state to grab these privately held resources and put them into the state budget, to stateize them once again, because that's the main source of ready cash in order to finance the state. When the price of oil goes down, then your capacities both domestically and internationally also go down with it. But even without that, if you look at figures before the collapse of the oil prices, you would see that there is a Russian economy which is worth about $2 trillion GDP, nominal. You can play with these numbers, in other words, but it's thereabouts, about $2 trillion. That sounds like a lot, right, if you just read that alone in a newspaper. But by comparison, the American economy would be 16 to 17 trillion. The EU economy would be 16, 17 trillion. And if you were to take either Germany or France or the UK or Italy, all of them have a larger GDP than Russia itself. Which is to say that economically speaking, and this is the weakness of that whole policy, economically speaking, Russia simply doesn't have those capacities, period. It doesn't have the financial institutions, the resources, it doesn't have what it takes, in other words, to co-opt and bring people into a larger hegemonic economic system. They just don't have the capacities. And it's here that we come to the events of 2014 and the Ukrainian debacle. When it was decided, partly by circumstance, but partly as long-term strategy, it seems to me, that if the economy won't do that work, we still have the army to fall back on. We can still go back to these techniques because this, at least, people will listen to. The first thing that Putin said after the occupation of Crimea was that, and now the world has to listen to Russia at the negotiating table. That was the first thing he said. Then he went on to the other business about ethnicity and about freedom and about treaties and whatnot. But the first thing he said is, this is proof that now everyone has to listen to us. This was the key point from his point of view. It's not a huge army. It's not a particularly good army. They have rockets and we don't know if they're going to fly. They have boats and we don't know if they float. But it's a big army and it's a huge factor to consider if you're one of Russia's neighbors, number one. It's also a factor to consider if you really want a mess of a war, even if you're NATO. It's something you have to reckon with, and they have nuclear weapons. We also don't know if those will fly, but if a few of them do, you already have a problem, and we don't know how far Russia can be pushed, and at one point they might actually go to that option because they feel they have no options, and this is their problem. Boxed in, fewer and fewer options internationally, and losing the geopolitical struggle in case after case, Ukraine being the most recent example. So if you can't sway opinion in terms of keeping Ukraine either dependent on Russia or at least deferential toward Russia, if you're about to lose the entire Ukraine, well, keep your influence one way or another. And this explains what's been happening in eastern Ukraine. It's not meant to be necessarily annexation. It's not necessarily to be long-term occupation, but certainly an instability which allows for regular Russian intervention in the affairs of its neighbors, since it cannot exercise hegemony. Because the tool used was ethnicity, in this case, aside from just the army itself, which required no further explanation, but because the justification was partly ethnicity, it can be used in any of Russia's neighboring countries, any of them, because all of them have Russian minorities. And here's where it gets dangerous. If you're going to use the card here, who else is going to use it on your borders against you, against each other? And who else are you going to use it against yourself? And so it becomes this dangerous, seemingly uncontrollable force. And on this count, I venture to say, this is my prognostication, take it or leave it, that actually these movements are firmly under state control, that they've tended not to emerge without the countenance or support of the central government, which suggests also that they might be able to be turned off if Russia decides to calm things down on its own borders. Ukraine was a particularly good case to choose because about 75% of the country is bilingual. Ethnically, 13 to 50% claims that it's Russian or is ascribed Russian identity. Slightly more than that speak Russian as their native tongue. It's enough of a mix, in other words. It is possible to say that there's not one Ukraine from their point of view, but several Ukraines, and we're fighting over which Ukraine it's going to be. Arguments to be made on both sides, in other words. As for American policy, the part I'd like to end with, American policy, to me, has been quite clear. I mean, long-term strategy has been not containment, which is what the objection has been coming from Putin in particular, that we revive the containment of the 1940s, it's a barbaric policy and whatnot, but rollback. Meaning not simply containing Russia within certain borders, but also rolling back its influence in neighboring countries as well, for better or for worse. I don't think this is necessarily a stoppable policy. Whether you'd like it to stop is another matter altogether, but at times it has been pursued as a reckless policy. And here's where I think some of the danger lies. The United States is an empire. The United States wields untold power. It's up to the United States, actually, in this case, to be the responsible party. I fear, when I see cases like what happened in Georgia, I fear what's happening right now when there's loose talk about arming Ukraine, when there's not really a preparedness to actually get involved and actually seriously become involved in conflict. So instead what we're doing is we're sending Ukrainians to be killed. I think the policies and statements of people like Nuland in particular, which is only one branch of American foreign policy, have been dangerous. Appearing during revolutionary demonstrations on the streets is not the role for an American diplomat. And appearances matter particularly in the Russian political scene. As I said, there's a difference here between what's going to happen in the long term, more or less inevitably, and how it is that one carries it out. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Yanni, for an amazing introduction to this discussion. Thanks to Leonid for convening this, and thanks to NYU Abu Dhabi and the Jordan Center for inviting me to participate in it. So I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that Yanni's talked about and some of the ideas that he raised in his discussion. My talk is just sort of called How to Make Sense of the Questions. And the outline of the remarks is, what I'm going to talk about is trying to start off by explaining sort of the opposite of what Yanni said, why we might think that Russia's behavior in going into Crimea and continuing on in eastern Ukraine is a puzzle. And then I'm going to give us a framework for thinking about Putin's motivations and implications of these different ways of thinking about it. So I'm going to try to I'm not going to give you answers to questions, but I'm going to try to help give what I think are the correct questions to be asking. And one of the major conclusions of this about what makes this such a difficult situation and such a peculiar challenge for policymakers is that if you think these motivations are coming from different aspects, the policy implications and the responses to them are radically different. And if time, I'll talk a little bit at the end about constraints that Putin might be facing moving forward. So get right back to where Yanni did about what comes next. But I want to start off by saying what I'm not going to do is predict what Vladimir Putin is going to do. Because unlike, well, like a lot of people in this audience, I can't tell you what Vladimir Putin is going to do. But I personally proved that I can't tell you what Vladimir Putin is going to do on the website of the Washington Post when I wrote a piece that was originally entitled Why Everyone Should Just Calm Down About Crimea, and laid out a bunch of reasons why it seemed for sure that the Russians were not going to annex Crimea. I listed these reasons in great detail, and one of the first comments from the posters said, in the comment section, wrote and said, Professor Tucker, these are well-reasoned, well-thought-out arguments. However, I think there are actually Russian troops in Crimea, and that was 3 hours after I had posted this online. So I think I can credibly claim that I cannot predict what Putin is going to do. And for about 3 months, I didn't want to go, after I changed the title of this to something slightly more responsible, and in the blogger's ethos, I actually explained how I changed the title, didn't change the text. You can all go back and find this online. After 3 months of not wanting to look at this, and it was remarkably well read. Nobody enjoys reading something quite so much as somebody getting egg on their face. But after a number of months, I went back, and finally this summer, I brought myself to go back and reread this. And here's what I would call the puzzle, or how I got it spectacularly wrong. Right? Why were the reasons that I thought Russia shouldn't or wouldn't go in and annex Crimea? Right? First, I looked at the relative strength of the Georgian army and the Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainian army, it's just not comparable to what the Georgian army was. Right? So these were totally, totally different ballgames. The second question was having, as a political scientist, but as someone who has spent a lot of time studying Russia and the post-communist world, looking back on the history here, right? There's one thing to send troops in to shoot Georgians. The next question becomes, how is the Russian public going to think about Russians fighting Ukrainians, given the tremendous shared joint history of these two peoples and these two nations, right? The third point reason I thought that this wasn't going to happen was because it would end up isolating Russia internationally, that there could be serious economic repercussions for this type of behavior. The fourth was that Crimea had an ethnic, Muslim, indigenous population, right, that had a long, brutal history with Russian occupation. This is, of course, the Crimean Tatars. Right? And Russia, of course, in the 1990s and 2000s, has a history of dealing with an aggrieved Muslim population within its own borders, right, that has a long period of history. So this seemed like courting disaster unnecessarily. And finally, as a political scientist, when I looked at this, I said, you know, what's the history of Ukraine? Ukraine is an unstable country which it is split politically. It keeps waffling back and forth between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian governments. The simplest way to get rid of a pro-Western government in Ukraine was to let it be in power for 4 years and then let the voters vote it out of office because they were dissatisfied with it and replace it with a pro-Russian government, right? Aftermath of the Orange Revolution in 2004, no one ever, and there is no one in this room who can say they were sitting there in 2005 and said, you know who's going to win the next Ukrainian presidential elections? Viktor Yanukovych. He's going to win the next presidential elections, right? But what would happen, I wrote at the time, what would happen if you annex Crimea? It'd be the same thing as the Tea Party making Texas an independent country, right? You take the most reliably pro-Russian bloc out of Ukraine, and at the same point in time, you alienate part of the country which was not inherently pro-Russian at all, and this is a much longer story that we can get into, right? The aftermath of the Orange Revolution, it has been argued by many, and myself included, this is not a story about suddenly, and I wrote this at the time, that Western policymakers should have interpreted the Orange Revolution as an anti-Russian movement. This was something I think that had a lot to do with internal dynamics of Ukrainian politics at that point, and in particular having to do with corruption and the way that election was run, right? So I said, if you do this, what you're going to do is guarantee that moving forward, you will never again have a pro-Russian government in Ukraine, because you're going to take the most reliably pro-Russian part of the electorate out of the country, and you're going to alienate the rest of it. All right, so I looked back on these things and I said, wow, those are actually pretty good arguments, right? Other than the Crimean Tatar one, history seems to have has borne out a lot of these other points, right? And so the puzzle then is, why? Why, with all these reasons, not? Did they go ahead and do this anyway, right? Or how did I, and let's be honest, many, many others at that point in time, and I did check with a lot of people, a lot of experts on the situation before I posted that thing, and I can show the documentation of checking with it. Anyway, how do we all get this wrong? And some of us more than others, and more publicly than others. Okay, so that leads to the question of what was Putin thinking, right? Which clearly I am not capable of telling you what Putin's thinking. But I'm going to try today to give you a framework for how, if Yanni's thinking about this as a historian, I'm going to try to think about this as a political scientist. And what I'm going to try to do is give you a sort of two by two. Political science, historians love to talk about broad arching sweeps of history. So political scientists love to talk about 2 by 2 tables, right? So I'm going to now give you about a 2 by 2 dimension for thinking about this. And I think, whereas I can't tell you what Putin is thinking, I think these are the two key questions. And I think we can slot most of what Yanni said into one of these quadrants that's created by this 2 by 2. The two key questions are, was Putin motivated by international or security concerns, the likes of which Yanni laid out many of them here, or by domestic ones? What's the major concern here? Is it security, or is it Russian domestic politics? And the second dimension is whether or not Putin was acting out of strength. Were these events that were planned ahead of time? Was this part of a grand plan? Or was it weakness? Was Putin acting out of a sense of insecurity, out of weakness, out of concern of the consequences for not acting? And I think if you intersect these two, and we think about international motivations, security motivations versus domestic politics motivations, and I'm talking about Russian domestic politics, and we think about whether Putin was acting from a position of strength or position of weakness, it gives us 4 very different perspectives, 4 different sets of all plausible explanations for what motivated this puzzle. Why were these steps taken that led to all these costs, which I think we can all agree there have been many costs borne by Russia for this course of action. All right, so the first one is the international security weakness quadrant here. And here the idea is, right, that it is security concerns, but it's fear. It's waking up very much in the world that Yanni just described, in a world where NATO has been gradually encroaching closer and closer and closer, and the Sochi Olympics take place, and at this moment of supposedly great triumph, you wake up and you find the West has come even closer to your doorstep. And this is, worst of all, it's motivated by Ukraine sort of acceding to the EU. This is what it's all about. It's also, and then from the EU, it easily becomes NATO, that this is a real security concern, right? And you could even point to more proximate security concerns, right? What is this going to say about the Black Sea Fleet? Was there a concern about the actual sort of very proximate concern about security concerns? In this story, the costs that Russia then goes on to bear of this cost of action are out of a sense of it must do something. It must put its foot down. It must stop at this point. It must do something at this point because it's in a position where it's constantly being encroached by, but it's in a position of fear. And in order to protect the security of the country, the government is pushed into doing something drastic that might be painful, but hey, at the end of the day, the point of a government is to protect the security of its people. And so it has to take this step, right? All right, so if you're a Western policymaker and you believe this story, right, which I would argue is sort of a popular story among people on the American left, then the way to address this is to treat Russia with respect. It is to satisfy Russia's concerns, treat Russia with respect, and that will diffuse the crisis. That will allow, if Yanni's right, that Russia can rein this stuff in, then Russia will choose to sort of rein this stuff in. All right. The problem, though, is that there's an opposite story, which actually tends to be popular with the American right, which is that it's still a story about international security, but it's a story about Putin acting from a point of view of strength, right? And that Putin, when you look deep into his soul, right, what he really longs to do is reestablish the Soviet Union. In fact, you can look to texts of speeches where Putin talks about the greatest tragedy of the 20th century being the breakup of the Soviet Union. Given that an awful lot of pretty crappy things went on in the 20th century, that's a big statement right there, right? And so the goal here is that Putin has come back to power. Putin, too, is about trying to reestablish the USSR. This is a careful, thought-out plan. It was a process that began with Georgia. It has to do with the testing of the Russian military in Georgia, probing its weaknesses, then pouring tons and tons of money into strengthening the Russian weakness, strengthening the army, and then was waiting for an opportunity to try out this new military. Ukraine comes along, boom, they jump in, they take this opportunity. But this is just stage 2. This is a multi-stage process, and it will take lots of other opportunities unless, dun-dun-dun, somebody rides to the rescue and pushes back against the bully. Here, the analogy is Munich, right, and Sudetenland. And so the policy implication, if you think this is the story, is that the way to calm things down is to show Russia that there will be real costs, and not to keep backing down and not to keep engaging in appeasement. Not to just give away territory and allow Russia to get away with this cost-free. And that you will have, sorry, that should say Baltics, not Balkans. But the policy implication is you need to respond forcefully or keep recurring. And the nightmare that keeps people awake at this, right, is what happens if this happens in Estonia, right? What happens if this happens in a NATO country, right? Is that the end of the NATO alliance? But there's another way of looking at this to make it even more complex, which is to say, neither of these stories are the key motivating factors. If you really want to understand why Russia is behaving in the way it is in these cases, what you want to do is look to Russian domestic politics. And here's the story here, and I think you can tell a couple of different stories. One story is that the protests after the 2011 Russian Duma elections stunned Putin, stunned the ruling regime. And it's seen as a betrayal by the middle class, which it was Putin who came to power in 2000, provided the stability after the chaos of the Yeltsin years that allows this middle class in Moscow, this business class, to prosper, to have security, to have stability. He provides all of this structure, and then the first opportunity, the liberals turn against him, right? And so he's got to look for a sort of new coalition after, if Putin 1 was a story about balancing the economists and the security forces off against each other, now we're ditching the economists. We're ditching the liberal, the business class entirely. This is going to be a more sort of Russian nationalism first, built around a coalition of conservatives and nationalists. Well, this is a coalition that needs to be fed, right? You can't just mouth these things. And so the security service people, obviously there are rents and there are goodies to be distributed, right? But the nationalists, right, you want to give something back to this part of your coalition. Well, Crimea, with its historical significance for Russian nationalists and for the Orthodox Church in the history of Eastern Orthodoxy, this becomes something to feed this new coalition. This is a way to show that Putin is representing his new sort of domestic coalition or providing goodies to his domestic supporters. So Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, this is an excellent opportunity to keep potential nationalist opposition to Putin at bay, because remember, one of the things about those protests in 2011 after the elections is it wasn't just liberals taking the streets. It was liberals, it was nationalists, it was communists. This was a potential dangerous situation where Putin could have gotten outflanked from both sides, right, and the current regime, right? So then the idea here is that you pivot and you reward your new set of supporters. Again, it's a weakness story. This isn't something Putin wants to do in the sense that it wasn't a grand plan. It's a reaction to the political realities after the 2011 Duma elections. There's a second version to it, right, which is that Euromaidan is threatening to the Putin regime, not because it means Ukraine is going to go into NATO, not because it means a massive Western infusion of aid into Ukraine, which, and we can sit and argue about this ad infinitum, but it would be my contention that if the Russians never go into Crimea, Ukraine doesn't see nearly the attention, money, or any of the things that it's seen from the West in the last 6 months, right? Or the last, I guess, 10 months now. But what's threatening about it is that it's a challenge to the Putin model. That Yanukovych is Putin light, and Yanukovych is trying to run Ukraine in the same model by which Putin runs Russia. And that these are the damning pictures. That what happens after Maidan falls and the Ukrainian citizens peacefully, not violently, not looting, but are walking through Yanukovych's palace and displaying gold-plated toilets, ostriches, collections of cars, a ship, right, in the presidential palace, right, that this is a threat. And it's a threat to Russian politics, because if it can happen in Ukraine, what is the message that Russian citizens are going to take away from this, right? And if Yanukovych has one ostrich, Putin probably had 4 ostriches, right? So what I wonder about under this story, this is the threat. And it is accentuated by social media, which transmits these pictures instantaneously of peaceful Ukrainians walking around displaying the wealth of the leadership, that the wealth has accumulated under this type of regime. Now, either version, right, there is this concern that there can be this threat to domestic politics. And one of the things that we do know as political scientists, that nothing bolsters a regime like foreign conflict in the short term, right? Foreign conflict leads to huge surges in popularity for leaders, especially when the people see it as legitimate, especially in a lot of different cases. But basically, there's this rally around the flag effect, right? So then you have a situation where for Putin, Putin can simultaneously boost popularity at home by getting into this conflict with the West, by protecting Russia against Western aggression, and at the same time, prove to the Russian citizenry that no good comes from Euromaidan. That when you look back on what happened in February of last year, the net result for Ukraine has been disaster, and people in Russia should be really happy that they have the stability of Putinism and not the chaos that is Ukraine today. To think about the policy implications of this story is a little bit more complicated. It's not in cut and dry as a security story, but it would seem to suggest that if you believe this is what's really going on, that Putin is motivated, and again, if you're this is what would be the policy implications if you're trying to tone down the violence. You're trying to lead to less fighting. You're trying to lead not to continue warfare between Russia and its neighbors. It seems to be here that if this was caused by a ratcheting up of domestic insecurity, right, the correct response might be to try to deliver a policy message whereby ratcheting down the tension, the fighting, the violence would lead to situations that would make things more comfortable for the regime domestically, which would suggest that economic sanctions, which can then be removed, might be an appropriate policy response. But what makes me incredibly nervous about this, and which keeps me up at night thinking about this, is that if this story is right, if this was a concern about Russian domestic politics, and it was a concern about the growing unpopularity of a regime with potential for unpopularity within its own country, right, and going involved in a foreign conflict against a neighbor that's also against the West boosts popularity, the temptation to return to that policy in the future, the next time there's a dip in domestic popularity, will be strong. Right? And if the lesson learned from this is the way to boost the regime, there's a lot of other neighbors out there that this can be returned to. So again, this gives us back to these really nightmare kind of scenarios. The final version of this is like, the final box is probably the least interesting, but this is the sort of domestic politics strength story. It's not that Putin is concerned after 2011, it's 2012. It's that Putin, too, has come back to power in the second, when Putin returns to the presidency, because there's been a strong recognition that the sort of moves towards openness, all these kinds of things Yanni's described, these engaging with the West, trying to set up this more open and capitalistic society was sort of a mistake, and that everything about 2012 is about building up the strength of the Russian regime, and that what Euromaidan as a challenge to the Putin model gives Putin an opportunity to crush whatever domestic opposition he's got remaining to this kind of Putinist state-type story. So again, it's not out of fear, it's seizing an opportunity, but instead of seizing an opportunity to advance internationally, as in the international strength story, it's seizing an opportunity to consolidate power at home. And in that case, for the short term, it's been incredible. It's been quite successful in that regard. Now, finally, I'll just take a couple more minutes here. Going forward and trying to get at this question of going forward. The big question is, right, is Putin constrained in Ukraine? And this is the map that everybody sees all the time. It's a Ukraine, it's split in two. This is the vote for Yanukovych and Tymoshenko in the 2010 presidential elections. Suggests there's an awful lot of space in Ukraine where Russia could continue to operate and continue to find support. But this is another map of Ukraine. And this is a map that shows the majority ethnic population by region, right? By this story, the vast majority of Ukraine is filled with provinces that are majority ethnic Ukrainian. This is from the Ukrainian census. And between 2012 and the 2014 elections, there was actually a really big change in the vote, and that, as my failed blog post predicted, right, you both take out some of the most pro-Russian parts of the electorate, but you turn other parts of the electorate more decidedly pro-Western or anti the sort of forces that are most closely aligned with Russia. You know, two important facts that get lost in all of this. Right? This is from a post by Ralph Clem. He's an eminent political geographer of the history of Ukraine and Russia. And right, in the last census in Ukraine, residents were asked about their ethnic identity. 78% said they were ethnically Ukrainian. Right? Ethnic Russians are 81% of Russia. Right? If you look, I mean, we've talked about the way things are portrayed in the news, but the way we get this picture of this is Ukraine is this ethnically racked society, and Russia is this like ethnically homogeneous society. They're actually not all that different in that regard. And also, and this is from a guy who wrote a book about economic voting in post-communist countries, but at the end of the day, people are going to care about the economy. Rally around the flag effects disseminate over time. If you don't believe that, ask the first George Bush, whose popularity ratings were at 91% in August of 1991 following the first Gulf War, how much he enjoyed his second term in office, right? These are not permanent effects. We know some political scientists don't know a lot, but we know a few things. One of them is rally around the flag effects dissipate, and economic conditions are always important. And that, you know, already by this summer, we could find polls that say 55% of Russians believe the Kremlin should focus on Russia's social and economic problems, and barely 5% that support the intervention of Russian troops into Donbass. Now, I cherry-picked that survey. I mean, I didn't cherry-pick it. I grabbed it from someone who wrote this up, Thomas Sherlock, who put this on the monkey cage. I'm sure you can find surveys that say other things, but this is an underlying reality, right? And then there's the economy, right? This is the dollar against the ruble, right? This is oil prices and an inverted scale of the dollar against the ruble, right? There is no way to argue that Russia is in a better place economically than it was at the end of the Sochi Olympics right now. And the question is, and the question will remain, right, how much that economic pain is going to trickle down and convert itself into dissatisfaction with Putin and the Putin regime in Russia. Now, we will hear over and over again about the stoicism of the Russian people and how historically Russians have learned to endure economic hardship, right? And there's truth to that. But there's also truth to economic voting, and there's also truth to the fact that in hindsight, we always look back on regimes that have fallen, and we often talk about problems with the economy, underlying problems with the economy, the social contract breaking down, right? Some of the language that's described what Putin did in 2000s for Russia is awfully similar to what was going on with Brezhnev in the Soviet Union in the 70s. So we have to think about the economy. Although, of course, as was absolutely correctly noted, in my original statement about the Ukrainian army being stronger than the Georgian army, it's nowhere near as strong as the Russian army. So this is a recent ranking of countries by military strength. Russia comes in at 2. This does value nuclear weapons quite highly. Ukraine comes in at 25. And you look just across all sorts of metrics, Russia is a much, much stronger military power. So in a sense, I kind of arrive at the same point that Yanni does at the end of the thing, which is about military versus economy. How much do these things matter? So the final note I will just end on is, was I right and Putin was wrong, right? Right? Would the Ukrainian army be able to inflict serious casualties on Russian soldiers if it comes to that? Right? What will the long-term economic consequences of the occupation be for Russia, for Putin? Here's an interesting thought experiment, right? If you went to the Russian leadership now and told them that oil would be at $50 a barrel in 2015, would they replay the situation the same way they have? If it's really a story about grand strategic strategy, the answer to that question has to be, well, probably is no. They should replay it. Yes, they would replay it the same way. If you think it's no, one of the things I think that's important in here is that when people analyze Putin, people who are fans of Putin, people who are opponents of Putin, people who don't like Putin, there tends to be an assumption made that this guy always knows what he's doing. And I think one of the things that we have to not get caught up with and be careful about here is to not ascribe to him the possibility that he, like other leaders, can make mistakes, right? So will Ukraine ever be a Russian ally again? Will a pro-Russian candidate ever win an election? Crimean Tatars, not much going on there. The bottom line is, has Putin traded long-term for short-term popularity when he didn't actually need to do so? So hopefully those are a whole bunch of questions that can give you a way to continue to think about these questions. So thanks very much for your time.
Keep it short.
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay, thanks a lot, Leonid, for organizing this, for inviting. And this is, I think, fourth or fifth time that we are having this discussion. And with every time, as Yanni would witness here, it's sort of becoming more and more difficult, more and more personal, and because the situation on the ground is getting more and more violent. So for us who care for what is happening in that region for personal reasons, the discussions simply become on a personal level more difficult. So I will try to be a bit shorter because we are about 25 minutes behind the times, and I will not sort of try to repeat the points that were repeated earlier. So let me sort of talk, picking up of where Yanni's presentation sort of was centered around this idea that we should look from the perspective of Russia to understand how Russia perceived the situation, and it's perfectly legitimate perspective. And that perspective, first of all, we should adopt if we want to understand what Russia was doing. So I want to spin it a little bit around and see how the situation is now being perceived by the countries around Russia. So I will be making 3 points here. I will be talking very briefly about Russia and its relations with immediate neighbors. Russia and the situation, the strategic sort of the situation that Russia now faces with the West, and what I think the Putin's short and long-term goals in this particular arrangement are. So the way I see what's happening in Ukraine is just one event in a long sequence of the events that happened previously that were not of this big magnitude. Okay, so let me tell you like this. So if you are immediate neighbor of Russia, you essentially have two options. You have an option of political and military submission, or you have an option of some kind of confrontation. And if you're lucky, you have an option of becoming a member of some alternative alliance and being able to withstand the pressure from Russia with some success. Okay, so what do I mean by political and military submission? So if you look now at the countries around Russia, you would have Belarus, Armenia, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, the countries that have some form of Russian military presence. I mean military bases or some other form of military infrastructure. Okay, the countries that do not have that, what happens to them? So let's start with places like, for example, Moldova. Okay, let's start with the places like Georgia, and now the third in this part of sequence, you have Ukraine. So the countries that you cannot subjugate in that specific, very direct fashion, what you do with them, you cripple them. You cripple them by creating a territorial integrity issue. That is, you take some piece of land. It doesn't have to be a big piece of land. It doesn't have to be a strategically important piece of land. It doesn't have to be a rich piece of land. Usually it will be a poor piece of land. Okay? And then you cripple and incapacitate that country to build a statehood as we know it. Because every time you have a country with territorial integrity issues not resolved, there will always be some political forces who will say, we have to go back and try to revise this issue and get back that land again. Okay, so that's what they did in the early 90s with Moldova. That's what they did in 2008 with Georgia, as soon as NATO was sort of moving in from the West. And that's what I think, to a large degree, they did now with Ukraine. So Ukraine now is going to be incapacitated both politically, economically, and internationally, because the issue of territorial integrity is very hard to solve. And without the solution to that issue, it's very difficult to proceed politically. That is, there are always going to be parties in Ukraine that will try to woo voters and political forces to say, look, we have to go back and revise. We have to get back Donetsk. We have to get back Luhansk. We have to get back Crimea. And politically, there's just not a very efficient position to have if you want to move forward. Okay, so from that regard, when Putin sees the situation that there are countries around Russia that do not want to belong to that sphere of influence, seeing Ukraine with the transformation that it acquired after the Maidan, seeing Ukraine being successful, politically, economically successful, that is prosperous and free, would be actually the worst thing that Putin could have. And I agree perfectly here with Josh's assessment here that if Ukraine were to become a successful country after Maidan, Putin knows that he would be the next in line to face something what Yanukovych faced. Okay, so for very important political reasons, he had to do this kind of containment by crippling Ukraine in a territorial sense. And the way I see it, this sort of is a very interesting situation, because Putin, to a large degree, is behaving like a insecure, difficult boyfriend. Okay, so his girlfriend says, "Look, I met someone else. Okay, her name is Western Europe. She's much more wealthy. Okay, she's driving a better car. Okay, she's very free. She doesn't have many complexes. Okay, and I really like to go out with her." And now he says, "No, you cannot do that. Okay, so I will actually lock you in my house, or I will try to keep you in my apartment, and you will not be able to see it. So the question, the natural question would be to ask you, so why is it exactly that you like someone else better than you like me? Okay, that would be a natural reaction, but for some reason, which I still do not understand, even having read a lot of history of Russia, is that this is not the reaction that they are accepting. Okay, the reaction is actually, I do understand that you don't like me, but I'll try to keep you in my sphere of influence at any price. And the fact that actually Russian public, at least in the short term right now, it endorses this kind of political position, I find it very, very strange. I hope it's a very short-term position. I really hope that it is, but I find it very strange. Now, let me talk about, immediate neighbors. Now let's talk about the West and the position of West vis-a-vis the Russia in this present situation. So what I think we always sort of, during this conference, we keep repeating, well, we don't see a lot of resolute decisions by the West. We don't see clear action. We see sort of lack of clear political direction as to what to do with the way Putin is behaving, right? And it's not difficult to understand why. Because this is precisely the behavior that a lot of Western political leaders cannot expect. What do I mean by that is the following, that a lot of Western political leaders, they are elected in free and fair elections, okay? And what they have, they are very sensitive to the cost that any kind of conflict can inflict upon them, because they know they're going to be voted out if there are economic, military, or other types of costs that can be incurred on them by certain behavior. Now, Putin, and that's his biggest strategic advantage, not the guns, not the nukes, not even political support, but his insensitivity to the economic and military and human cost of the conflict in which he is participating right now. So again, in political science, we do not know a lot, but one of the things that we do know is anytime you have a conflictual situation, the party who is willing to incur more cost on itself is going to be always a victorious party. And that is why it was very interesting for me to observe the Minsk negotiations between Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia, is that the way these negotiations were going on, it seemed to me that the Western Europe, especially Angela Merkel, tried to put itself in the weakest possible position vis-a-vis Putin. What do you mean by that is the following. So if you remember, just a few days before the Minsk agreement itself, she announces first in Germany that they're not going to send arms to Ukraine. Then she flies to DC, says exactly the same thing, standing next to Obama, okay? And then goes to negotiate in Minsk. And I just do not understand this position. I just do not understand this position. Okay, think that you will not send arms, okay? Have it as your policy, but don't say it publicly. Okay, don't bind yourself with that specific promise, especially because you are an elected politician and you made this public pronouncement that will be binding for you as an elected politician. So I was trying to understand why exactly that position was taken, and I have two interpretations. One, I think, is a positive interpretation. I hope that's what happened. The other one, I think, is more negative interpretation. So the positive interpretation, I think, is that there might be some tacit agreement between US, UK, and Germany and France on the other side, is that they are going to be playing good cop, bad cop diplomacy here. That is, Merkel with Hollande will try to persuade Putin with some carrots, and then US and UK is going to provide some sticks, okay? That's one possibility. Another possibility is that it would be a little bit more disturbing that this is just an appeasement strategy. That is basically, by taking this very, very weak bargaining position, Merkel just says, okay, you take as much as you want in this particular conflictual situation, as long as you can in some way credibly commit yourself that you're not going to proceed further. So the question then is, if this kind of appeasement strategy is going to work long term, what would it bring? And that actually brings me to the question that Josh raised about predicting what the Russia's next move is going to be, because that's precisely the same thing. If we are going to give away now, if the Ukraine is going to give away Luhansk and Donetsk, is it going to be enough for Russia? And so if we look at the history here, at the very recent history, right, it's interesting, because after every little appeasement that Putin accepts, there's going to be some another step. So let's look. So before Crimea was annexed, very many reasonable people, including some of us here, said that this is not going to happen because this is not reasonable. This is not cost efficient, right? This is not politically reasonable. This is not even reasonable from military perspective. Okay, but that happened. After Crimea happened, then people said, okay, well, maybe that's enough for him. Okay, he crippled Ukraine, and this is where it's going to stop. Okay, so then we have the whole thing in eastern Ukraine with Donetsk and Luhansk. And now, after Minsk agreement, the question was, okay, maybe we're going to stop at the borders of the present conflict. But then just two days later, okay, they take over the Baltsev, a very important town in eastern Ukraine. And then you look at it and say, okay, maybe this is going to be the point at which the situation is going to be stopped and the appeasement will work. But now, today, everyone is talking about Mariupol as the next place, okay? So the question is, how far is it going to go? And is this appeasement strategy working? So I don't think it's working full term, but I think there is going to be some point at which obviously is going to be the end to that. Why do I think that? Well, so actually, let's go back now and let's think about what is happening with each of those regions that Russia indirectly or directly annexed. You know, so I'm talking about Moldova, I'm talking about Abkhazia in Georgia, I'm talking about South Ossetia in Georgia, now Crimea. Okay? These are very, very strange political and economic entities. These are neither countries, nor they are parts of some countries. These are very undefined entities, which means it's very hard for them to trade. It's very hard for them to develop any sort of reasonable economic infrastructure, and they are very, very expensive to keep. Okay, they are very expensive to keep. Let me give you some numbers. Okay, so Abkhazia, which is 240,000 people. So International Crisis Group has reported that between 2013 and 2015, it received $1 billion, roughly, of course, it's an estimate, in direct subsidies. Okay, in direct subsidies. That's a massive amount of money. South Ossetia, 200,000 people. So direct subsidies from Russia are about 150% of its own internal GDP. Okay, so you take country's GDP, give that, and add 50%. That's as much as it pays in direct subsidies. Crimea, 2.4 million people. Now, it's been estimated, okay, it's going to cost $4.5 billion a year, and this is from Russian Ministry of Economic Development, so this is not Western propaganda numbers, okay? So already now, Russian pension funds, again, official figures from Russian Ministry of Economic Development, Russian pension funds have been drained by $7.2 billion just to pay for Crimea, to start accruing funds to pay for Crimea. So I think what is going to happen, we're going to end up with a situation of some sort of frozen conflict where some chunk of land in eastern Ukraine is going to be taken, and Putin is not going to go very far into Ukraine because occupying Ukraine is very easy. Governing Ukraine after it's being occupied is going to be much more difficult and much more expensive. And given the oil prices and given the fact that Putin had 15 years of constantly rising oil price, and he didn't manage to build any durable economic institutions, okay, essentially wasted all that money, that means simply they are not going to have enough money to keep those regions that they annexed in a specific fashion at peace. And that's, I think, is going to be a big incentive for them to stop at some point. And of course, the nightmare scenario would be different, that his main objective is not only to cripple those specific neighbors which are not now members of NATO, but also to break NATO itself, because that gamble would work in a very simple fashion, right? It would just take a very small insurrection somewhere in eastern Estonia, and then the question is, should NATO intervene right now or not? And because Russia is going to proceed, if it does that, it's going to proceed with this, old salami tactic. They're not going to go full speed. They're going to do it very, very slowly, so that you're always in this fog of war, and you don't know whether invasion actually already happened, and we should invoke Article 5 of NATO or not. And at some point, the writing is going to be on the wall that, okay, there is a Russian invasion and no one has done anything, of course. Then NATO as such doesn't have any reason to exist. But I think this move would be very, very risky. And the last thing I want to say, so the fact that Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, yesterday or this morning, I don't remember, announced that they're going to send 75 people from military personnel to train Ukrainian forces, I think that already is an indication that the West doesn't want to face that specific endgame, that they want to contain the conflict as it is in a specific location in Ukraine right now, as opposed to it being spilled over and having far more far-reaching consequences than it does right now. So I wanted to be very short, so thank you.
So I'm very conscious that we're now eating into your opportunity to ask questions and possibly even to have drinks downstairs. So I'll keep my comments as brief as possible. I'm going to depart a little bit from some of the more sober comments in their tone and allow myself to speculate a little wildly, as is only appropriate given that we're nearing the end of the session. And specifically, I'm going to focus on the question that has come up, and specifically very clearly in Arturas' presentation, about what is likely to happen next. And there's going to be a sort of speculation about what is likely to happen next, and a bit of a normative angle to what I think should happen, perhaps, depending on where we're coming from, what kind of assumptions we have about Russian interests and Western interests. And most importantly, I'm just going to stress in my presentation that Ukraine is also a party to this process, and it's very often forgotten, and certainly when we see the coverage of the conflict in the press, there's a discussion of Western interests, EU interests, US interests, and Russian interests, but Ukraine has a right to be a party to this, obviously, as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about what Ukraine interests are potentially in the situation. So what are Russia's interests? What is Putin being motivated by? My personal hunch is that Putin is being motivated by security interests more than by domestic interests, but this is not to say that the domestic factor is not present. I know for a fact that the Kremlin was extremely worried about the colored revolutions, and specifically about the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, as something that might potentially be happening in Moscow. And Moscow very carefully studies all of these situations to try and figure out whether this could happen. If it does happen, then what does Moscow need to do to prevent this from toppling the regime? So let's assume that Russia is primarily motivated by security interest to keep Ukraine within its sphere of influence. That means to keep Ukraine out of NATO, but also out of the European Union. So the problem then, from Moscow's perspective, is how do you do this credibly? How do you secure a credible commitment from Ukraine and from the West that Ukraine will not join NATO and the European Union? And one of the difficulties is that Moscow believes, whether rightly or wrongly, but more rightly than wrongly, unfortunately, that Ukraine is kind of a failed state and sort of has been a failed, poorly managed state since its independence in 1991. And therefore, commitments by Ukrainian leaders on any issue of grand policy, grand strategy, are not credible. And so a commitment by Ukrainian politicians to remain out of NATO and the European Union are not credible. So then Russia would need a commitment from the West. So effectively Angela Merkel, Leonid, and Barack Obama would have to promise to Putin, and do more than promise, because promises are not sufficient if you're an elected politician, because another party will come to power in 3 to 4 years' time. The West needs to credibly commit itself to keeping Ukraine out of NATO and the European Union. Are there any possible mechanisms for that? Imagining that the West is prepared to surrender Ukraine and to say Ukraine belongs in the Russian sphere of influence, which in itself, of course, is contested and should be contested. But let's say that the West goes along and says, yes, we will make this credible commitment. What does it look like? Is there a possibility of such a credible commitment being put on the table? Do you amend NATO rules? Do you write in that certain countries that belong in the Russian sphere of influence will never be able to join NATO? Do you have leaders of the European Union agree to that as well and have that as effectively a constitutional provision in the European treaty framework? Probably unlikely. And so this is one of the big problems for Putin when he looks at the situation. He doesn't believe that either the West or Ukraine can make a credible commitment for the medium to long term for Ukraine to remain out of Western alliances. And therefore, the solution is simple. You create a reality on the ground which prevents Ukraine from ever joining a Western alliance, security alliance or an economic alliance. And the way you do that is that you create a reality of a failed state in Ukraine. You capture territory in a hybrid war situation, you create a secessionist region, and you create a conflict that's going to last for the foreseeable future, or for as long as Moscow wants it to last, on Russia's terms. Now, what that means is that Ukraine as a failed state cannot receive funding, or as a state with an internal conflict cannot receive funding from the IMF, so no possibility of IMF loans. It's one of the rules that they have. Ukraine cannot join NATO because it has an unresolved secessionist conflict on its soil, and you create the reality on the ground. So I think that from a security perspective, at least, this is how Moscow views the situation. And that's unfortunate, because what it suggests, of course, is that the conflict will continue and that eastern Ukraine will remain a secessionist territory for the foreseeable future. What are Ukraine's interests in the situation? Ukraine doesn't have a very good hand to play, as Arturas has kind of hinted at. Ukraine's interest in this is peace at all costs. In fact, in my conversations with some people who are now senior in the government in Ukraine, there is a real discussion, at least there has been a real discussion about giving up on these regions. They are expensive to maintain. There is a large mining sector there that is not terribly economically efficient. And, you know, there is a talk of surrendering these regions. So saying to Russia, if you want them, you can take them. And what's happening with the gas negotiations, for those of you who've been following the news, is a little bit like this now. Ukraine is basically saying, we're not going to pay for your gas. You know, Russia should be paying for it. And Russia is saying, well, hold on a second. If this is your territory, you guys should be paying for gas. We are recognizing your territorial integrity. You have to pay for their gas, right? And Ukraine is saying, well, de facto, this is not our territory. So Russia should be paying for this gas. So, you know, there is a bit of that happening. But what's important for Ukraine, I think, is that the current leadership obviously has to be presented with a face-saving opportunity. You know, if it moves to meet Russia more than halfway, as it's done in Minsk, it needs to have some opportunity to save face because, you know, President Poroshenko, while he's effectively a kamikaze president, and I think that he sort of understands that there are other people in that political alliance, young politicians like Yatsenyuk, like the mayor of Klitschko, who has presidential ambitions, mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, who has presidential ambitions. These young people want to come to power next. They want to be elected by the Ukrainian people. And so they're not prepared to accept any terms from Russia, right? They need something that they can bring to the electorate and sell, spinning it in some way. So is there a common ground here between the West, Ukraine, and Russia? Well, the common ground is so this is, I should just say, assuming that we are okay, we here, you can interpret this as you like. There are some Russians here, some Westerners, some people from the US. If one is okay with the fact that Ukraine should remain within the Russian sphere of influence, then the common ground has to be that one has to make a credible commitment to Ukraine staying out of NATO and the European Union. And that has to be a commitment that is made by the West. And the difficulty with that is that it's very difficult to make a credible commitment. It's very difficult to think of a framework within which that commitment can be made credibly. If one disagrees with that assumption in principle, if one says, actually, there's no reason why Ukraine should remain in the Russian sphere of influence. You know, things change, security and economic situation evolves. The Ukrainians want to be with the European Union. If one accepts that as a fact, as a reality, then one needs to be acting much more swiftly than one is doing at the moment. If one is the US, France, and Germany, one needs to provide military assistance to Ukraine. One needs to be prepared to go as far as it takes to withstand Russian actions there. You know, whether that means that you admit Ukraine into NATO under some exception or bind it to NATO in some way and commit yourself to providing military assistance in case of a full-scale Russian invasion, then that's what it takes. But I think that this middle ground that Western countries are currently taking, that Merkel, for instance, is taking, is unsustainable. You either do one thing or the other. You either credibly commit yourself to keeping Ukraine out of the European Union and NATO, or you do the opposite. You say that it's a matter for Ukrainians to decide, and if they wish to be in Western security and economic structures, then the West should commit to support that desire. And very briefly now, on the last note, I just wanted to say a few things about the situation in Ukraine. What is the nature of the problem? What is this conflict all about? I think that hopefully everybody in this room would agree that Russian meddling in eastern Ukraine is apparent. But at the same time, this is not just an issue about Russia meddling in eastern Ukraine. There is a genuine conflict within Ukraine having to do with Ukraine's political identity. Ukraine is a young state. It has no history of independent statehood prior to 1991. And it's a state that's currently negotiating its political identity. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? And there is disagreement on that, disagreement for various reasons, for reasons having to do with different imperial influences going back to the 19th century, to the fact that the interwar period was experienced differently because some parts of Ukrainian territory were part of Poland in the interwar period. The World War II period was also different. Parts of Ukraine were under the Gouvernement Général and other parts were under Reichskommissariat Ukraine. There are historical differences. There are conflicts internally within Ukraine about Ukraine identity, what it means to be Ukrainian, and where Ukraine should be in the medium to long term, politically. Should it be with Russia? Should it be with the West? And in many ways, this is a classical story of the tragedy of contemporary nationalism. The fact that you are forced to choose one identity over the other. You cannot be both things. You cannot be a Ukrainian who wants to have the economic development of the West and who appreciates Russian culture at the same time. Somehow that is not possible, and that's classical tragedy of modern nationalism. And you have to choose one versus the other. If that is the case, if Ukraine is finding itself in this place where it needs to have this, to go through this process, then that should be a matter, an internal matter for Ukraine. Ukrainians should have an opportunity, without pressure either from Russia or the West, to have this conversation internally. You know, one could say that this has been happening already for the past 20 years. That is true, the process has not been completed. And I think that ultimately what needs to happen is a series of referenda in Ukraine without outside influence that would give Ukrainian people a chance to actually speak out and say, do they want to be with the West? Do they want to be with Russia? Do they want to be part of NATO? Do they want to be part of the European Union? Or would they rather maintain neutrality? You know, should that be written, for example, into the Ukrainian constitution? And so on that note, I'm going to end, and hopefully we still have, well, let's say that we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. I'm just going to stand over here. It's going to be easier. Any questions? Yes.
So I was interested in your kind of analogy of Putin as this abusive, insecure boyfriend, which I think worked well with your claim about him worrying that the Maidan Forum posed an affront to the Putin model and that he's kind of acting as from a position of weakness. I wonder if we could turn this idea on its head to consider how the EU and the US are acting and whether certain developments make them act out of a position of weakness. You know, what has been going on with Greece now makes Germany seem like a less than ideal boyfriend as well. And could this be in some way the US and the EU especially trying to project an image of strength when places like Hungary are turning maybe more to the Putin model, or even the Czech Republic, which is probably one of the most Russophobic places in Europe. You know, 70% of a recent poll said they would support Russia in this conflict in Ukraine.
70% said
that they prefer Russia, that they see that think that the West is acting inappropriately in the situation.
So I think that the West has done many blunders in this situation with Ukraine. I think the way they proceeded with Maidan, that they made it a public thing that this is Western-supported revolution, was a big strategic blunder, and it shouldn't have been done like that. There shouldn't have been a representative of the State Department. I would totally agree here with Yanni. Even if you agree with that on a moral, ethical grounds, politically, it was a huge blunder. So I do not in any way, so the way I see the situation, I do not position it in a way that you have a perfect West, the perfect US, and here you have an entirely, failed Russian leader, an entirely failed Russian state. I really do not, I hope I did not construct situation like this. Now, if your question is, can the West, or is the West in some ways overreacting to what Russia is doing right now? I think, and if anything, it's actually underreacting. I don't see where that overreaction would be right now, except of those blunders that I mentioned right now. Right? I just do not see where, at what point would someone with any expertise in this topic would come out and say, okay, Germany actually did too much. They pushed Russia too much on the Ukrainian issue, or that Hollande, who actually looked a bit like a deer caught in the headlights, in Minsk, he really didn't know what it was all about. That he actually is too pushy with Russia right now. So I do not exactly see it this way. Having said, I do not think that, of course, these are perfect statesmen and perfect states. Definitely not.
So not everyone needs to comment. If you feel that you'd rather pass, then we can return to the audience. Josh?
That's fine.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
How, in your guys' opinion, does the document that came out, I think it was either yesterday or today, that indicated that the government had been planning such an interference into Ukrainian affairs, how does that change the conversation?
If I may, just to start, this document is not a government document. It's a report that was submitted to the presidential administration, and that's among several different things that were circulating around presidential administration. That newspaper that released the report, that published it, claimed that it was put together by this Russian businessman. So it's not a government document. Having said that, it's clear from other factors that the Russian government was planning annexation of Crimea before Yanukovych actually fled from Kiev. This is just a factual clarification. I guess you can comment on the substance of the
I mean,
question.
the easiest answer is that everybody's been interfering in Ukraine, and it's not surprising at all. The Americans, the Europeans to some extent, but they tend not to be very good at these things. But certainly the Americans and the Russians were doing it all along. Right? So I don't think we see really how it changes anything, nor is it surprising. You know?
I mean, to answer sort of the two questions together, take a little bit from the two questions together, I think when you look at the role of the West in this, right, there are two different questions I think we may want to ask. And I think it's important in these discussions, right, because it gets very easy to slip into discussions about the West versus Russia and how about the West versus Russia. And there's like 35 million people in Ukraine, right, who live there, and this is their country. Or 43 million people now, right? So, I mean, we've got millions of people living in this country. And there's one question to ask, which is to say, as people in this country want to choose a model for their future, right? If you're sitting in Kiev and you're 21 and you're in university, and you've got to look at whether you want your future to be more like someone in Poland or someone in Moscow of your age at this point in time, right? That's a really important story to be told about where that motivation can come from. I mean, going back to the Orange Revolution, right? We were writing these things 10 years ago. There was an attempt at the end of the Orange Revolution by Westerners as well as by Russians to write the Orange Revolution entirely as a story of Western influence versus Russian influence in Ukraine, right? But then there was also a huge story of Ukrainians and their reaction to a government that was blatantly stealing an election, showing no respect for the rule of law and getting caught doing these things, right? So that's one story about it. But there's a totally second question that we can divorce from that, which is to say, what's the West's appropriate response to what's going on and whether or not the West has made the appropriate response given the conditions that are on the ground. What I was trying to lay out in my talk is just how complicated a question it is to figure out what the correct appropriate response is, because it has a lot to do with what you think is motivating Russian behavior in this particular case, and what you think is the end game, right, that we're trying to encourage right now. If the end game is to encourage the cessation of hostilities and to calm things down and to not continually have the potential for conflict between Russia and its neighbors and ultimately Russia and the West, there is a sincere disagreement about what's the best way to go about going there. I would argue that there is a bit of a consensus that the middling path, right, is a difficult one to hew to. I think that one of the things that I've seen about this, and when you talk about spinning it on its head and Western weakness, right, one of the most interesting arguments I've seen in discussions of this in recent weeks is that this concept that, you know, power, military power, is always going to have some function of geographic proximity, right? So we have an asymmetric conflict here in the sense where Ukraine is always going to be much closer to Russia, right? And that leads to, despite the disparities in the actual military, that leads to a preponderance of advantage on Russia's side to the extent it's a military conflict. On the other hand, as Yanni was demonstrating, on the economic side, right, the West is so much stronger economically than Russia is right now. So one line of argument is that the West should be fighting this battle on its stronger turf, which is on the economic dimension, than getting caught up in the military dimension. On the other hand, that's, you know, there are consequences. If you think the story, as much as Arturas was saying, is that this is just and sort of as the one story I was spinning about the continued probing, right, there really does become the question of how much fighting it on the economic grounds are going to work. Now, if you think it's a story about Russian domestic politics, then it comes back to the question that Leonid raised, right, which is that Arturas mentioned here, which was this fundamental asymmetry, and the real question becomes, how much does Putin worry about support from his own population? And here, I would go back to this idea that all sides in this, regardless of what motives they attribute to Putin, he is getting this kind of continual treatment of Superman, and it sort of behooves a lot of different people in this argument to put Putin forward as this great leader, either who has to be stopped or this great leader who's standing up against Western imperialism, right? But there's not a lot of ideas out there that Putin is making systematic mistakes. And there is a problem with people who stay at the party too long, right? Another thing, a political scientist, right, when you're a leader, when you're in power, when you have unquestioned power for longer and longer periods of time, you become increasingly surrounded by people whose own careers, own promotions, own financial well-being is dependent on pleasing you. And that makes the quality of the advice that you're able to receive, I think, lower quality over time. So in retrospect, it's very, I mean, Timur Kuran has this wonderful article about how we never know these things are going to topple, and then as soon as they topple, it was completely inevitable that they were going to topple, right? And so you can see this being written, the history of this 4 years ago, about exactly as Arturas said, we're already shelling out all this money in Moldova and in Georgia, the overreach to go into Ukraine, the cost of the troops, the cost of the armaments, the cost of the subsidies to Crimea, and Arturas was giving conservative estimates. That was just sort of to replace what the government subsidies. Yeah, official estimates. I mean, there's still, if you want to build things, you want to do construction, right? And so I think that this is, you know, to me, then a lot of this leads to this big question of like, at what point does Putin lose the support of his own population? It's certainly not now, but to say that it's never, right, in an era of plunging oil prices, which as noted, there was these missed opportunities to sort of reorient the Russian economy, for better or for worse, that's what they're living on now. That's an important question. But again, it's so complicated because it depends which of these motivations you think are paramount.
Okay, so there are lots of questions. We're going to group them now. So let's have the 1, 2, 3, 4 final questions. Let's just start with Arturas, go down the line here, and you don't need to answer every question, just a few thoughts on whatever you.
So I'll just answer very briefly 2 questions. So I think that the question, is Ukraine going to be fine? We always tend to think about something that, you know, reality will reach some stationary state, right? And things are going to be fine. I think we're gonna muddle through, you know, some years down the line, things are going to be okay by the definition of that time. But I don't think in any way there's going to be a paradise scenario where Russia returns Crimea, returns Donetsk and Luhansk, so that territorial integrity is not an issue anymore, and everybody, you know, sings Kumbaya and is happy around the fireplace. I do not think that is going to be reality, even if there is a change of government inside Russia. This is already de facto. Even opposition in Russia says, you know, Navalny has said that de facto is Russia, and I don't think anyone can revise this issue. And as long as that is the case, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to swallow the pride and forget about it. And with warlords, so I just actually read an interview today with some of the separatists in the East, and they are saying it very plainly that they are just regrouping and using the Minsk agreement ceasefire now as something to regroup. And the most exciting picture over there was the Jesus picture on a flag, the Orthodox icon Jesus picture. So when you know, it's not ISIS, but when I put these 2 things together, it's kind of a scary reality.
Yeah, these are all great questions. I mean, I think when I think about, you know, is there a possibility of anything working out okay for Ukraine? You know, you think a little bit about Czech Republic and Slovakia. And I always come back to the split of Czechoslovakia, that like every country that goes through these convulsions and these violent civil wars, and Havel being like, yeah, okay, we'll be better off, you know, this way. I mean, there is some, you know, I think there's some, I think in some ways one of the most damaging things that's come out of this conversation tonight is that it looks like, you know, the consensus among a lot of this discussion is that what's really in Russia's interest is not annexing part of Ukraine and letting the rest of Ukraine get on its way, but what's really in interest is like building more of these frozen conflicts, and that's probably much harder for Ukraine, and something that we haven't talked that much about here, but for Ukrainian domestic politics. As Arturas laid out nicely, there's a destabilizing element to politics when you can always have this revanchism appealing to a sort of far-right constituency in your politics. So it is, I think, it is depressing. I think it's less likely right now. I shouldn't say this because of my luck with Crimea. I think I think the likelihood of a full-scale invasion, despite the fact that this keeps being talked about, is less likely than it may have been at earlier periods of time. I do think a lot of this hinges on the extent to which Putin perceives any vulnerability to his own rule in Russia. Because if he doesn't perceive any vulnerability to his own rule in Russia, which he may very well not by dint of having been in power for so long and having come back to power, you know, so smoothly after what happened in 2011, then he can continue to bear these economic costs, and there are these very strong asymmetries here, right? And we really don't know what the end game is and what his long-term goals for coming back to power and staying in power are. On the other hand, if he views himself as this is Regina Smith, who has done all sorts of amazing work on, is working on a book right now on the last Russian protests, right? If he's looked at that and perceives that there's some degree of concern about, and realize, I mean, we forget, Putin's been a guy who's been obsessed with public opinion polls, right, through the whole time he's been in power. This is someone who wants to know what the population is thinking. And if part of what he took away from 2011, and Regina can speak to this much better than I can, but if part of what he took away from 2011 is that this popularity is fleeting and it can disappear quickly, right? Maybe he's read Quran, right? Then there's Timur Quran, not the Quran. That there's a concern that there are going to be long-term economic costs to what's going on in Ukraine, and that whether or not that can be coupled with a decline in the price of oil, then there may be an incentive for a cooling down, but then that leads to the question of what happens at that point. And then there's this really interesting tension, because if he can't get them to sort of step down and he hangs them out to dry, then what happens to this new coalition that emerged after 2011? And by the way, one sort of closing remark on this, like if Putin falls from power, there is no guarantee that whoever replaces him is going to be more liberal. Putin could very well be replaced by someone who's more nationalistic. So that's an open question too, and it's important to remember that the alternative to Putin is not, there's a lot of alternatives to Putin out there. And eventually there will be an alternative to Putin, but, so I think a lot hinges on how secure he sees himself. Yanni?
I wanted to go back to the question you posed, because I thought it was a good one, that Europe is not looking very good right now. I mean, sort of the European Union in particular. So, you could say that there's an internal conversation going on in the European Union about what should the European Union be. And it's a conversation we need to have, because right now it's looking pretty ugly. It's not the European Union of growth, of, income transfers. It's the European Union of, as one person put it, the fiscal waterboarding, right? It looks pretty ugly for a poor and smaller country. Now, even fiscal waterboarding will look better to Ukraine, right, than what it has now, right? Do you see what I'm saying? And that kind of power is irresistible. I'm not saying this is justification for Europe, quite the contrary. But from their point of view, this is still a better idea. So what are the outcomes? I think there are also, anything is possible, really. I mean, all sorts of possibilities. There's nothing determined in all of this. And I think if you look at it in terms of the three players, Leonid is right. I mean, we're not Ukrainian specialists. We need to find Ukrainian specialists, but we haven't been able to. If you look at the three main players, you can imagine a scenario in which I think the Czech-Slovak option is a real one. Cut off eastern Ukraine, take it, you're on your own, and now we're going to develop as the western part, central and western part. Put that alongside a Russian satisfaction that its honor and interests have been satisfied. One of the things that the Russian government decided recently, which has a long historic precedent, is that we don't care about the economic and human costs. Here is the state interest, which takes primacy over everything else. Or to put it another way, all of the human interests are subsumed under the state interest. This is not aberrative, this is not unique necessarily, and it's certainly not new. So that would be another piece falling into place. And as for the United States, all I can say is stop doing dumb things, right? I don't know how else to put it. Why do you so openly provoke people? Why do you openly insult and demean? You can achieve the same things quietly, gradually. If you put these three pieces together, meaning Americans stop doing dumb things, Russian state interests satisfied, and Ukraine willing to, at least temporarily, put aside one of its regions, sure, there's an outcome. And I don't think it's beyond the possible. I won't predict it on the Washington Post, but I think it's possible. Right, sir? Yeah.
And then very briefly, I think that the date that matters for Putin, the only date, is his re-election date, which is going to be autumn of 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So he has some leeway here, The campaign the campaign usually starts very late, so he has at least 1.5 years to sort things out. And even in 2017, things can go in both directions, right? Because he can use Ukraine to increase his public support, or he can play it down if the economic situation is poor. And so the key, I think, everything hinges on the economic situation and the price of oil. We saw that graph. If the price of oil keeps at this level, at this relatively low level, or decreases further and stays low, then Russia has fewer and fewer options. Even though they've decided that economic costs don't matter, they will be forced to change their policy if price of oil remains low for a prolonged period of time.